Hi, I'm Jeff McErlain, and welcome to the latest edition of Tone Tips for TrueFire. And today I'm going to talk about amplifier wattage. I'm not going to do much guitar playing. Actually, I'm not going to do any guitar playing. I'm just going to talk a little bit, and hopefully you won't get too bored by me. And I'm going to look at some notes because I want to remember all these things. So lots of things to talk about. First thing is, a lot of times people will ask me, what is the right wattage amplifier to get? And that is a complicated answer, and it usually comes down to how you're playing, how you play the guitar, what you watt out of your amplifier, and what kind of gigs you're doing. So let's start off with a few little kind of wattage facts. I'm just talking about tube amps because I'm a tube amp guy. That being said, I use solid state stuff. I use digital recording gear, plugins, things like that, and I'll talk about that in another Tone Tips, because they've revolutionized everything. They sound really great these days. Is it the same as playing through a real amp at full volume? No, it isn't. But can't always do that. So I live in New York City, so there's people living right on top of me, literally, and so I cannot crank an amplifier. All right, so my first thing is, how does wattage work? Well, I don't want to get too into the scientific stuff. I'm going to talk about tube amps. So a 50-watt tube amp, it's all perceived volume and how many dBs the amp puts out. So the first thing about a tube amp, and I discussed in the dialing in classic Tone Tips, is the louder a tube amp gets, it reaches sort of a point where it doesn't get much louder. The curve goes like this, and you get more distorted and more compressed. And sometimes, often in tube amps, you can go too far, as I demonstrated in the classic how to set up a classic guitar sound with my old Marshall, where it doesn't sound very good if I crank everything, because it just gets flubby and not very pleasant sounding. One amp I use quite a bit for small gigs in New York City. Say if I'm playing with a singer-songwriter, and I just need a low wattage, like a low volume gig, but I want to use a tube amp. I have a Fender Pro Junior, which I think is just a great little amp, really reasonably priced, and I believe they're 12 watts. And the thing about that amp is I can turn it up a little bit, and it sounds nice and warm. It's a really pretty decent amp, and I like it for other reasons. It's very portable, really light. I can bring it around, relatively inexpensive, all those things. And Jeff Beck used one for a long time on the road. On an aside. So there I can actually have the amp. It's a tube amp. I can turn it up to about 3, and it still sounds good and it gets nice and warm. The tubes are working the way they're supposed to work. A thing about tube amps is the tubes work at optimum. They sound the best when they're working where they're supposed to be working. So 100 watt, like my 100 watt Marshall or my 100 watt Two-Rock sounds best when the amp is pretty loud, because that's where it's working, where it's designed to be used. All right, so the little Pro Junior, which is great for certain gigs. I'm not talking about miking amplifiers, because people are going to say, well, you can mic it. Yes, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about playing in a band and keeping up with the drummer or being the right amp for the right gig. So the 12 watts is really cool in many situations, very low volume gigs. I used to play at this wine bar with my band, and that was the perfect amp. It was a very small room. I didn't want to get loud, had one 10-inch speaker. It was the right amplifier for the right room. One day I decided to bring a 30-watt 112 amp, and it was just too much. Like, I didn't have the volume that much, but just the sound of the amp was just too big for the room, and it just felt so much louder. It was just the wrong amp for the wrong room. So, all right, so that's another thought. All these things, there's no simple answer. There's no free lunch, right? Okay, so 12 watt Fender Pro Junior is great for a lot of gigs. And certainly, like I said before, if I was playing some places like in New York City, the bitter end, a 12 watt amp can be really great if they're miking it. If I'm playing with a singer-songwriter, it's great. So that's not an amp that I would want to use with my trio, because I want to have more dynamic range. That brings me to this point. So what happens with the amp, and like I said, I can't really show you too well here because it's all going to sound the same through the speakers, is if I'm playing and have that amp at, like, say 4, where it's kind of starting to break up, I level out at that volume. I peak out, right? So it doesn't get any louder, it just gets more distorted. So if the drummer is playing, they start hitting, and I'm playing harder and pushing overdrives, it's just going to compress more and it kind of flattens out. There's nothing I can do. I have no horsepower left. So if you look at tube amps or wattage like horsepower, how much you need for that gig. So the next one kind of up, there's AC-15s, just 15 watt amps. But say something like the really popular amp is a Marshall 18 watt or the Fender Deluxe Reverb, which is 22 watts. Now there you're getting to something that's going to have more headroom. I find the Fenders have a little more headroom than that particular Marshall, because I have that particular Marshall. And that's great, once again, because you have this more clean headroom. For me, if I'm going to have one amp that I think will cover most of the range, I think 30 watts or 30 to 40 watts is a really great number, because there I have some clean headroom. I have space before the amp starts breaking up. So you have to really think about the way you play the guitar. So for instance, just to backtrack, I have my 20 watt Marshall, which is really great if I'm playing a blues gig and it doesn't need to be that loud. It's going to break up pretty early. And I control everything with the volume of my guitar, and it's really, I think it's a really great amp and a really nice solution for many rooms. If I need a loud, clean sound, it is absolutely the wrong amp to bring, because I can't do that. There's no loud, clean headroom on the amplifier. This is where it brings me to something about 30 watts. And I talked to a lot of my guitar player friends, True Fire buddies, professional musicians. 30 watts is a really nice kind of sweet spot, 30 to 40 watts, because that allows us that clean headroom like I was discussing. And then we can also get the amp to kind of do its thing. Sometimes. Now, many amps have master volumes, but it doesn't even matter if you have your master volume up all the way. If it's a low wattage amp, it's going to distort more. Right? So if you want that clean headroom, I found in most situations, 30 to 40 watts will give you that kind of leeway. All right, then you might ask, well, Jeff, I see you have a 100 watt amp here and a 100 watt amp here. Well, the first thing is I can drop this down to 50 watts. It does have a master volume in it. And the same thing with this 100 watt Marshall. I did put a half power switch in it and also put a master volume in it so I can actually control the amplifier. So here's my other kind of point. The other way you can approach playing through an amplifier is playing through a louder wattage clean amp and using your pedals to get all your sounds. So they call it a pedal platform. So this 2-rock, if I'm not using the master volume, let's just say, I can get a really great loud clean sound out of this, and which is my favorite thing about this amplifier, like I've heard no other amp do. It's huge, great, clean sound that is just a pleasure to play. Now, if I want to get more overdrive, I can use pedals, because there's so many great pedals out there that we know these days that will emulate the sound. If I could turn this up to 10 and get it to overdrive the way I want it to, if I want to get more overdrive out of the amplifier, I can use pedals. So this case, what I love about that idea, and most of the times if I'm traveling, fly dates and things, I'll ask for, sometimes you don't always get what you want on tours, Fender Hot Rod DeVille or something like that. It's pretty much the industry standard for an amplifier. It's 40 watts. I know Michael Landau, that's what he orders, and he has his own amp designed after that, because he knows what he's going to get. It's a good, clean pedal platform, and he brings his pedals, and I bring my pedals, and a lot of my friends ask for those amps because you know what you're going to get. You bring your pedals that sound best, and you get a lot of clean headroom. So in other words, the amplifier is really just making your sound louder. Right, the sound that you have in your pedals, so you know what it's going to be. So in an amplifier like that, and sometimes the way I run this, depending on the gig, is I know I've got a really great platform in which to build my pedals on top of, and then the sound will remain consistent from gig to gig. So that's what I'm talking about with clean headroom. So if I want to have that idea of where I can get a nice big clean guitar sound and I can dirty it up via my pedals and not worry about the amp topping out or running out of horsepower, that's the way to go. Now there are other things that are really come into play, like speakers. The efficiency rating on a speaker. So like the classic Marshall Greenback, a 25 watt speaker, was a few things. One, back in the day when they started creating them, that was the highest efficiency they could get. And over time they got to be more efficient. So more efficient, like usually speaking, the higher wattage on a speaker, if you have an 80 watt speaker, it'll be louder than a 25 watt speaker, because a 25 watt speaker kind of attenuates the sound of the amplifier. So if you're running 100 watt Marshall into two 412s, if you ever get that lucky to do that, through 25 watt speakers, that's going to be really, really loud. But if you ran that same thing through two 412 cabs with 80 watt speakers, it's going to be a lot louder. So the speaker also helps attenuate. Other crazy things that I've discovered with my 2-rock, for instance, I have the 212 cab and I've got a 112 cab. The 112 cab sounds half as loud to me as the 212 cab too. So how much air you're pushing out makes a big difference. A 112 combo is not going to sound as big as a 212 combo or a 212 cabinet. It's just you're pushing more air, and you have two speakers running, so everything becomes more efficient, so it's going to be louder. So for the professional guitar player, you kind of need a few different amps. That's really the answer. Okay, so I know that may or may not have been helpful, but it's the things that you have to think about, especially when making an amp purchase. Well, to recap everything here, and like I said, maybe I'm in a little bit stream of consciousness because there's a lot to talk about in this. So from guitar player to guitar player, depends on what your gig is, and that will really determine on what size amp you need for that gig and how much clean headroom you like. Now, there are, of course, master volumes in amplifiers, but the truth is, if it's a 50 watt amp and you have a master volume and people say, oh, it sounds great at bedroom level, you're really just hearing preamp at that point. Now, it could sound good, but it's not going to sound the same as it does when you turn the amplifier really up. Thank you for checking out this video, and hopefully it has answered this question, or maybe it's actually created more questions. I don't know. And hopefully it was not too boring to listen to me sort of stream of consciousness about this. Everybody's going to have their own opinion on what is right for them, and of course that's your decision to make. This is just based upon my experience as a professional guitar player and been trying to figure this thing out for many years. The right amp for the right gig is the answer. I would always choose kind of the middle ground, 30, 40 watts. I think you're going to be totally safe in most playing situations that I can think of. Please check out my website, jeffmcerlain.com, my YouTube channel, Jeff McErlain YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, all those things. And of course, check me out at TrueFire, and I'll see you soon.